Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. My name's Louise Mallinder. I'm Deputy Director of the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice. I'm co-chairing today's event with Dr. Julia Viebach. And we are both really delighted to be welcoming our friend and colleague Pierre Hazan to Queen's today. Before we start the seminar, I have been asked to read out the usual safety announcements, so please bear with me. We're not expecting any fire alarms to go off. The check was done earlier today. So if we do hear any evacuation notices, we have to leave the room. I've been told we have to go out through that door there and go down the rear staircase. And we make our way to the assembly point, which is the car park between the Lanyon building and the graduate school. If you are unable to use the stairs, make your way to the refuge area on the landing of the staircase and use the intercom. Please don't use lifts, and we should stay outside the building until we're told to return. But hopefully none of that will happen. It never happens, so it should be fine. So turning back to today's seminar. So this event is sponsored by the Mitchell Institute, the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work, and the School of Law. And I think the fact that so many departments in the university were willing to be involved in organising today's event, I think is a sign of what great interest there is across the different schools and disciplines in the university for hearing about today's speaker. And I'm sure many of you, like me, have learned a lot over the years from Pierre's writings on transitional justice and conflict mediation. Fields in which he's long been a leading voice. So he's written widely on these subjects, and some of his books in English have included Justice in a Time of War, Judging War and Judging History, Localizing Transitional Justice, and most recently, the fascinating Negotiating with the Devil Inside the World of Armed Conflict Mediation. And so our discussion with Pierre today is going to focus primarily on that most recent book, which is available for purchase in the lobby. You maybe noticed on the way in. So Pierre's scholarship, I think, for me, has always been such an important contribution to the field of transitional justice, because not only is it thoughtful, but it's inspired by and informed by a wealth of practical experiences from different parts of the world. Pierre's CV is too long for me to list all his various projects he's been working on, but just to note just a few. He was a diplomatic correspondent for leading international newspapers. He worked at the UN High Commission for Human Rights. He's been a senior advisor at the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue. He was a member of the International Contact Group on the Basque conflict, which co-organised the conference that led to peace within that conflict. He's also, in recent years, been a commissioner on the French Independent Commission on Reparation and Reconciliation for Sexual Abuses. He's also a member of the Integrated Transitions Law and Peace Practice Group, which I have the pleasure of working with him on. These diverse experiences have meant that Pierre has worked in conflict zones in Africa, the Balkans, the Middle East, and Europe. So I think we're delighted to have him with us here today. The format of the event will be that rather than a lecture, Julia and myself are going to be asking Pierre a number of questions, and then we'll open the floor to invite questions from you all. So, Julia, do you want to get us started?
Yes. Well, welcome everyone to this special event today. I'm really pleased to have Pierre here with us today. And I wanted to start with a couple of more personal questions to get a sense of his work as mediator in conflicts. So, whilst you're also doing all this important work trying to reach peace in many conflicts in the world, how did you actually find the time to write this book? And why did you write this book at this specific point in your career?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you, and thank you so much for having me, Louise and Julia. Okay, I was extremely lucky. What happens is, I think. The book is about the devil, but sometimes there is just the opposite. And one day I received a letter in my office, which I don't go very often. So it stays there for a couple of weeks. And actually, it was a letter from a German foundation, the Bosch Foundation. And they invited me to develop a project of my own for a year at the most. And suddenly, I had time to do whatever I wanted. So basically to write. And I think it was so at a project for a very long time to reflect about what's happening for many of us, actually. What are we going through? The challenges of a time. And it's true that we are living in a very, very tense period. The defense spending is skyrocketing. It's $2.5 trillion. No one knows what it means. 200 million people are living under the control, total or partial, of armed groups. 120 million of refugees and IDPs. So we have huge numbers. We don't understand what it means, really. And in the same time, you are trying to do things. But while trying to facilitate, to mediate, to bring what you can, sometimes you are yourself confronted to hard choices. And I wanted to address these hard choices. We all know the price of war. We have seen images of what's happening in Gaza, not many images about Sudan, but Sudan is terrible, and Ukraine. And there have been more than 1 million people who died in Ukraine and Russia, between Russia and Ukraine. And we know that there are apparently already 50,000 orphans in Gaza. So we have this terrible situation. So we know the price of war. So I decided to ask a kind of bizarre question. What is the price of peace? Because everyone thinks that the price of peace is great, and it is great, obviously. But how does it happen? Who is paying the price, really? Is it only the bad guys? Or are they civilians? Are they specific groups? Are they minorities? Are they third parties? So I tried to reflect about that. And I guess it started by a personal experience. Like very often, I think when you choose a subject, I think many of you start by your own personal experience. It has to have some resonance with yourself. And so it went back to Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I was part of a humanitarian team. And in a terrible camp, it was really awful. And people were already dying in this camp. And there was some type of mediation happening at very high level. We didn't know about it. But with the small team I was with, we received an instruction to select a third of the inmates to liberate them. And then the question was, how do you choose who will stay in prison and who will be free? And it was kind of Sophie's choices, but in the opposite, but still Sophie's choices. And for me, it was extremely shocking doing that morally. I felt morally it was very difficult. And so I tried to reflect in many other places. I work in many, many places. And what's the price of trying to make some good? And so, and then it's true that in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also in Syria, there were sometimes very, very difficult situations about what to do. Sometimes you're confronted to a situation where it's either you help a process of ethnic cleansing in order to save lives, or you don't do nothing, and people will die as a result, and you don't know. So what choice are you going to make? Are you being part of a process of a policy of ethnic cleansing is being part of a war crime? But doing nothing is possibly even worse. So I started to brainstorm about that type of dilemma because there was very, very little literature, and that's why I can focus on that.
Well, you talked about the fundamental question that you are tackling in your book is what is the price of peace? And many people would probably think that peace itself is the goal, and that's the price that people receive. And we will probably come back to that question again at the end. I don't want to go ahead too far at the start. But perhaps you can tell us a bit more about the experience that you made with people on the ground, and some experiences that perhaps have profoundly influenced or shaped your own answers to this question and the question about morality, the choices that you have to make.
Well, I mean, well, a lot of, it's let's try to frame it almost in a normative framework. The 90s were a time of expansion of two things, two different fields. On the one hand, you have a huge expansion of the UN role and of peace agreements, and on the other hand, you have a development of international law and the international justice system, the two ad hoc UN tribunals for Rwanda and former Yugoslavia, the Rome Statute with the ICC, and so on, the hybrid tribunals. And obviously, one question which arose at the time and still very much alive and kicking is obviously the peace versus justice dilemma. So again, you are struck when you are in a situation and there is some negotiation. And is it helpful or not helpful if someone is being indicted? What will be the consequences? I believe it's very difficult to come up with a kind of general answer. It has to be specific case, contextualized. But for me, one very powerful example was Charles Taylor in Liberia, in Sierra Leone. Charles Taylor signed maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 peace agreements and possibly 10 ceasefires. And he broke all of them. But in the same time, the UN decided to do something important to create another peace conference. We, in the country of Kofi Annan, who was at the time the UN Secretary General in Ghana, with 4 heads of state from Africa, and in the same time, and with Charles Taylor. And Charles Taylor is going there physically, and suddenly the prosecutor said, well, disclose his indictment, accused of crimes against humanity and war crimes. And the whole field collapsed. And what's amazing is, on the one hand, it was a UN tribunal, and it was a UN conference. So you see the totally schizophrenic situation. But so was it the right decision by a prosecutor to stop a peace process? I think we can discuss that for a long time, and again, it's very specific. But that type of dilemma, the question of forced deportation of people, the question of peace versus sometimes human rights, is a real question. We can think about Afghanistan, we can think about Aceh in Indonesia, we can think about other cases. We can think about the Sahel region and maybe local agreement, maybe we can talk later about that. So you are making choices and hard choices. And I think for me it was important to clarify the choices being made.
I hand over to Louise. I hand over to you.
Sure. Thank you. One of the things I think that struck me looking at your book was the title, The Language of the Devil. We were negotiating with the devil. And I think that language, the idea of the devil, makes me think that things are very black and white, that there are people who are good and evil. And reading your book and listening to you speak, it's clear that many of the people you've had to speak to are responsible for atrocious acts, really, really horrendous human rights violations. But our own experience of peace building here in Northern Ireland showed that we had to engage with paramilitaries and during our peace process, people who had been involved in political violence did become part of our political life in different ways. And peace has sustained. They were agents in different ways for that peace process. And so I guess I'd be interested to hear a little bit about the use of this language, this idea of how people see perpetrators of violence as the devil, as terrorists, as people who are beyond the scope of what we can talk to, and whether there are times in your career where you've been able to see the people you've worked with as beyond that, as people who are able to contribute to peace in different ways.
Well, about the vocabulary, I mean, even I think yesterday Trump talked about the Democrats as being evil. Mm-hmm. I mean, today, I mean, basically war is about dehumanization. Mm-hmm. And everyone became some kind of monster. Mm-hmm. Putin is looking at Zelensky as a Nazi. Netanyahu is talking about Hamas as terrible things, and Hamas is doing just the same. So everyone is using a vocabulary of hate and dehumanization. And at one point, I mean, war basically ends only by two ways, by military victory or by negotiations, and 99% of the time through mediation. Mm-hmm. So at one point, you engage in an inflammatory vocabulary, but at one point you need to back off and to enter in some kind of discussion. And so for me, I was interested to see how we are using moral categories which are just inflammatory but not useful at all, but who have consequences, which have consequences. For me, it's amazing to think, I mean, everyone knows about the Pinochet case and universal jurisdiction. But when you think that it was Cicero who talked about the pirates as enemy of mankind, and because of a pirate, the concept of universal jurisdiction was developed, I think that's really interesting. So the question is, how do you put in or out of mankind? Mm-hmm. And in the same time, putting someone out of mankind and not being able to gain militarily, at one point you need to enter in a serious discussion. And so I guess the time is not ripe for a serious discussion between Ukraine and Russia, or between Hamas and Palestinians and Israel. But I mean, at the end of the day, there will be something happening. It can go on, but at one point, no.
In contexts where the timing is ripe, what role can mediators play in helping people dial down the inflammatory rhetoric or begin to see the humanity in those they've opposed?
I think people are looking for their own interests. And own interest could mean many things. The people who are, if you're in charge of even an armed group and you control part of a population, even like ISIS, for instance, or you are in charge of a government, you have a constituency, and you need to provide for this constituency. And so sometimes you will need some things. You can need vaccines, you can need humanitarian aid, you can some people want to know the fate of a missing, and so on and on and on. So your work, I guess, at one point is to build a team with what we call the connectors. Because, I mean, you need to have in your team people who are able to access directly someone close to one side and someone else, or more people who are able to access the other side. And then you are trying to identify the entry doors. Mm-hmm. And so it could take some while to find the entry doors. And then to try to strike a balance which creates a possibility of some kind of limited agreement. And then at one point the question of ceasefire can arise. But ceasefire could be also tricky, because ceasefire could be just a ruse or a preparation for an attack to the other side. So you need to be to be as clear as possible about what you want to achieve, what means you are using for what ends. And obviously, if you are a strong, when the Americans are doing mediation, like we did 2 years ago between Israel and Lebanon, to trace, to delimit the maritime border between Israel and Lebanon in order for each country to exploit the gas in the Med Sea. Well, the presence of the US as a strong player was extremely useful. Sometimes, in some situations, you see that weak mediators can be more effective. So every situation is different, and the timing, as you mentioned, is also very important.
Thank you. Julie, I think you had a question you wanted to ask me.
Yeah, so you talked already about the morality, right, and making choices in terms of when to save people, how to save people, and whether it's about saving people on that specific moment or whether it's about keeping in mind the bigger picture, which at the very end is perhaps some form of peace agreement, right? But what really struck me in your book was this balanced discussion about questions around impartiality and neutrality and the meaning of those words in conflicts where you don't really have this clear line between conflict parties either, right? You have a fragmentation of parties who are fighting, you have a fragmentation of international actors coming in, and I was wondering against that backdrop really, how do you define the red line in your choices, in your moral choices that you have to make, like on the ground in a specific time frame? And this is where the temporality comes back. And sometimes probably in minutes you have to agree to a deal or you have to decline it. And that will have an effect on the life and death possibly of hundreds, if not thousands of people. So really, how do you redefine this line from case to case, perhaps from minute to minute in the field, but also is it that, would you think that the right to life is the one that trumps, everything else, every other right? And in that context, you also discuss in your book how peace brokers have been complicit in actual ethnic cleansing and this engineering of population transfer. So how do we define these red lines? What do you do as a mediator?
Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, as you mentioned, right to life trumps every other right, because if you are not alive, well, the other rights won't be very useful to you. But it took me a long time to reach that conclusion. Because it was still very difficult to abandon all the other rights in order to save the bodies. And it's true that when you think about certain situations, and let's be specific, if we speak about Syria, at one point the third parties, and there have been a number of third parties who played a role, and it was given, basically your population which were besieged, living under bomb, not having humanitarian aid by the Assad regime, and they were given the choice to go to another city, which then in turn will be besieged. And the whole thing will continue and continue and continue until you reach Idlib, and that's the end of the road. And here we are still being besieged and being bombed. So, was it the right thing to do? So, there have been intense discussions. Some people say you are not providing any long-term solution. What you do is not useful. Some people said, well, you're trying to give some hope and hoping at one point that the political equation will change, and in doing that, you are just saving people. So that type of discussion. So from my perspective, what is also interesting is what I've seen very often is people just want a piece of paper as a success. But I think it's very important to try to reflect about the price to peace and the price to save lives. What are the consequences practically? And so that's why I think, there's a French philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, who spoke about practical wisdom. What is practical wisdom? Is simply the fact that a number of people, I think it's almost, I'm not a philosopher, but I think Aristotle already said it at the time, can gather and can try to discuss a very difficult subject. And then you end up after a heated conversation. And I think it's important to create a kind of safe space inside organization. And I have to say that it doesn't happen not very often, but you are able to create such a safe space to exchange arguments and in order to decide the lesser evil choice.
So, but in terms of Syria, what would be your answer then to that question? Was that the
I think
right
it was.
decision?
I think it was the right decision. Yeah, at the end of the day. Yeah.
And just following up on that, I was wondering, when you were talking about practicality and bringing in...
Sorry, just because a lot of people who were in Syria went before, I'm part of this generation, who basically, our university was Bosnia. So we went through Bosnia and then there was Syria. So we had in our mind Srebrenica.
Yeah, of course.
And at the time of Srebrenica, there were some international, and we were discussing what to do. And there was one guy from UNHCR was saying, well, if we leave, it will become a free shooting range. Is it correct in English? I don't know.
Fire zone.
What?
Free fire zone.
Free fire zone. Thank you so much. And other people were saying, no, it will be just like usual. They will put the men in a camp and it will be badly treated, but they will be all right. And that's the view which basically prevailed. And then the UN didn't want to intervene and all of that. So when you think about Syria, having this background in your mind, your perspective is also being tainted by your own history.
Sure. I think, Pierre, you've already mentioned some of your concerns about how international law operates in contexts of peace negotiations. And I was interested there hearing you speak about the importance of understanding the context, trying to understand the dynamics on the ground. And, of course, international law is generally about universal norms that are applicable at all times in all settings and should apply in all contexts. And so it's quite the opposite framework, I think. But I'd be interested just to know a little bit more about how conflict mediators engage with the law. To what extent is it something that informs their practice, informs how they talk to the parties, informs how they think about what they can do or not do, and also perhaps what they understand as the law, because they can be different frameworks they could choose. Are they going to be framing their conversations in terms of international humanitarian law or in terms of counterterrorism law? Is there going to be recognition for traditional or customary approaches to law within peace agreements? To what extent are those types of questions about what law is something that can form part of mediation?
I'm afraid I guess the huge majority of people who are involved in mediation are extremely pragmatic people. Mm-hmm. So the conversations tend to be limited, and there was a moment when it was almost a collision between two perspectives. It was the mid-90s. On the one hand, you had Desmond Tutu, who was talking about the Truth Commission, and you had Goldstone, the ICTY prosecutor, saying, no, sentencing is important. And then a lot of mediators came into that discussion and they say, we don't want additional requirements or conditions because a peace deal is so complicated. So on the top of it, if you add other conditions, you make it even more difficult. And then you will be responsible to make the war lasting longer. So in fact, you are responsible if the people are still dying because you put additional conditions. So it was a very, very heated discussions at the time. And we know what happened. Basically, ICC is existing today. It's a reality, and everyone needs to accept it's a fact. So you need to deal with it. So I think the peace versus justice is the most obvious discussion regarding law. The rest is about the question. You have some discussions about human rights and regarding when you write a peace treaty, for instance. And I'm thinking about a specific example, Aceh. Both sides agreed on the peace treaty, but both sides also agreed at the very last moment to get rid of all the provisions regarding human rights. And all the provisions of human rights get away. That's also a reality. So I think it's important to have a normative framework but then, so at one point, I think leaders take into account the existence of law and international criminal law, and they're concerned. But once they have been indicted, there is no more carrot. There is just a stick. So what does Putin is afraid of, or Netanyahu, or Sinwar, or someone else? So that's also part of a conversation that we need to have.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no, I'd agree with that. I think there's very limited studies about what the impact of these arrest warrants actually has on the ground, and such different perspectives that I think are often informed by normative views more than political realities. Another theme that came up in your book somewhere is the idea of using international criminal justice as a weapon of war. So, rather than seeing law as an obstacle, as an additional constraint that gets in the way, actually thinking about law tactically, something that could be advantageous. And I was interested about this because, as you know, like we were both doing work on Ukraine for a few years, and it's a place where the Ukrainian Ministry of Justice has actually created a website that they call Lawfare. And on it, they talk about all their various litigation strategies around the world for what they describe as their legal confrontation with Russia. So it's very clear, looking at this, that law and how they appeal to international law in the courts is very much part of their multifaceted campaign. And so law is a tool for that confrontation. So I'm wondering if you could tell us more about how you think law is sometimes used for political or military reasons within conflicts.
Well, I think it's starting to be well documented, actually. You mentioned Ukraine, but also Ukraine was very much in favor of creating a special tribunal for the crime of aggression. And in the beginning, the West was in favor, but got a bit cold feet because good backlash also. But we can think of so many examples. 2010, the flotilla, humanitarian flotilla to Gaza. It became almost a laboratory case of using justice or international law as a weapon. Basically, there were 5 different reports. 2 by the UN, which were contradictory. 1 by a panel being created by the Secretary General, and 1 by a commission from the Human Rights Council. And we have opposite conclusions. Then the Turks judges, I think there are 2 reports from the Turks and 1 report from the Israelis. So basically, everyone today is playing the game of law. Sometimes we have seen when, there have been some on the web, there have been some confidential information which have been disclosed, and a British ambassador was proposing to to put pressure on the prosecutor to abandon charges against one accused if he was doing something. So, I mean, everyone is playing law as a parameter. A few weeks ago, I was in Israel and Palestine. I talked to some Palestinians who are involved in with the international criminal justice. And for them, it's very clear law is one front. There are many fronts. Obviously, they want to defend, they are speaking on behalf of the Palestinian victims. But for them, the struggle is larger. It's about self-determination. So everyone has a political agenda.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And of course, for the Palestinians, law has been a long-term struggle for recognition. We're trying to go through different mechanisms.
Very slow, very slow process. Yeah. Very difficult. Many obstacles.
Julia.
Okay. Pierre, I would quite like to spend a couple of questions on the theme of colonialism, the legacy of colonialism, and perhaps what subaltern studies called coloniality. So it's really social sciences and law and peace and conflict studies, probably more recently so, are fields that are more or increasingly so looking at the role colonialism plays in our world today and our not only politics, society, how we perceive of the other, and that's very interesting in relation to terrorism and counter-terrorism and the perception of the other. That will come a bit later. But my question is basically whether the field of conflict mediation has tapped into that discussion of coloniality and whether there is a trend towards decolonization of conflict mediation, especially given that colonial powers have been very influential in a negative way in current conflicts. We just need to look at the continent of Africa and the scramble of Africa and all the implications, long-term geographical and geostrategical implications that came with colonialism. So if I go in as a mediator coming from one of those former colonial powers, where do I actually get my legitimacy from when I speak to a local person or one of the conflict parties? So how do you deal with that in your day-to-day world? But on a sort of meta level, also, is there actually a discussion around coloniality in the field of conflict mediation?
I guess I'm working for an organization, possibly, I think it's the biggest private organization doing mediation in armed conflict. And the way we operate, we work with local teams. So without these crucial people, I think our role will be extremely limited. And it changes everything. And I think it's very important. And thank you for bringing that. Local mediators are just so important. They understand the situation, they know their culture, they have a lot of success. So for us, it's absolutely key. But it's also dangerous for them. Very often, they could be perceived as traitors or spies. I have a couple of friends, I have two friends who lost their lives in Mali because they were perceived as spies. And one was belonging to one community, the other belonging to the other community, and we were pretty sure that we would be safe, and we were wrong. So yes, local people, extremely important, that's for sure. And sometimes being a Westerner, and often I'm the only one, or not many, can help and can also give some protection to them. So that's a dimension. Then to get access to certain level of international diplomacy, the game is a bit different. Okay, so we need to speak about what type of context. Now, regarding colonialism or coloniality, it's too difficult to say. I think you're very pragmatic, very much. So obviously Africa will be very different if the Congress of Berlin didn't happen in 84, 85 of the 19th century. It happened. And we see the result today. But the result today is more complex. And very often when you speak about colonialism, I think for me the discussion is a bit too narrow because we speak about France, about Britain, about Spain, Portugal. We speak much less about Russia, which was also an empire. We speak much less about the Ottoman Empire, who was also in Crimea. We speak much less about so many other places and so many other empires who imposed their stronghold and their vision and their domination. So I think we need to have, and if we speak about specific cases, take Mali, for instance. We have slavery. There have been slavery for a long time in Mali. And most of the merchants were Arabs. And today, one of the tension in Mali is between northern Mali and the rest of the country. And it goes also back to the history of slavery, but not so much, again, regarding white people, but the tension between Arabs and Africans or black African. So I think if we want to engage in that type of discussion, let's go for it, but let's go really for it, and not stop with some kind of political correctness and really engage. I think it's important for me to be correct, and in order to reflect the realities and the complexities. And very often it's important to understand the dynamic of society. And maybe colonialism is also visible in the fact that how the armed groups are being organized as a result of the past. And if you want to understand Boko Haram, for instance, you need also to go back to history. But at a certain point, then you need to engage in a much more concrete and day-to-day conversation.
But would you then say that pragmatism trumps these kind of considerations in your day-to-day work on the ground?
I tried personally. It's I would say I'm interested by history, so and I like to understand the dynamic of society. So I need to understand at least a bit of each where I'm working. So I think it's important. Yes. It's not about having the idea of some Westerners flying from one place to another place. Maybe it might have been true, but it's for me, it's not working.
So perhaps to stay with this idea of the local and localizing, you have been involved in writing the book with Rosalind Shaw and Lars Waldorf on localizing transitional justice. And in terms of localizing and really paying respect to the complexity of the local, do you think that this could be a way for mediation to actually decolonize? If we haven't actually touched on the question whether this is actually necessary. But do you think that this could be a way that you have local intermediaries, basically, who sit down with those communities and try to broker a peace, even though that might be, as you said earlier, quite dangerous for themselves. But on the other hand, you also talk in your book a lot about impartiality and neutrality. So these would then actually go away because people are really involved in it. But on the other hand, they will know the community and the complex histories in all their facets much better than anyone coming in from the global north telling them how to broker a peace. So the question is, how do you, again, balance this in your pragmatism, but perhaps also moral choices that you have to make on the ground?
So, let's be very concrete. In the Sahel region, my colleagues from these different countries, so because we work in many Sahelian countries, they have done limited local deals. Basically, in the Sahel region, you have lots of conflicts. You have the big conflicts with the jihadists, but you have a lot of micro conflicts by dozens, literally by dozens. And the main reason is one of the main reasons is climate change, which changes the corridors of transhumance. I don't know.
Grazing. You move, crop move.
Yes, it's specific highways in the deserts, basically. And because of climate change, these highways in which the herders were using are no more effective. So they need to go to the lands of the farmers, which creates, in turn, huge conflicts. So now we have, if you start from Senegal to the whole continent, to the very east, you have possibly hundreds of micro conflicts between herders and farmers. And so what we tried to deal in dozens of places is to try to, and here it's only my local colleagues who are doing this job, to create with their own approach mediation. And sometimes it's fascinating because the way they mediate is totally different than us.
So how do they mediate? Tell us.
First of all, they bring the whole community. So you might have 300 people or more to discuss about what is important is the land and it's the water and a few things. So they need to find some agreements. And the conversation can last 1, 2, 3, 4 days. So it's very long. It's very transparent. In the background, you have someone from the state, but the state has no real hands on the ground. It's not really present. So there will be someone representative of a state, and you will have also some people representing the armed groups, and which at one point will basically bless or give their agreement, their assent to the agreement. And that's how it's working. These agreements exist because the nation state is not effective at all. It has disappeared, basically. So that's why we have today hundreds of armed groups in the Sahel region. And when you are able to find some kind of deal between A and B, you are very happy. The problem is when suddenly there is a change of power and C is coming, and when the delicate equilibrium is being threatened.
So would you say in the whole that such fragmented peace deals or localized peace deals, depending on what language we want to use, are more sustainable? Or are they as sort of perceptive to any, as you said, change in power than like a bigger like international diplomacy?
I think they are very fragile. Very fragile. You need a state, but there is no real state today in Mali or in Burkina Faso. Well, I mean, the Russians are I would say helping. I don't know if it's the right term, but yes. When a state collapses, you have in such a situation, and in order to minimize the conflicts, you are trying to do something, and that was our suggestion.
So perhaps the last question in this on this topic. I couldn't help when I was reading your book to think about Rwanda 1994 genocide. And you discuss at length in one of your chapters on Bosnia, Srebrenica. So, and we could think about this in a framework of coloniality of being, or to speak with Judith Butler on the question of grievability of life. And I was wondering whether after 1994, when the international community sent their troops into Rwanda to evacuate all the white people and left Rwandans there to die, a very cruel and agonizing death. In Srebrenica, they decided that Dutch life is worth more than a Bosnian life and withdrew, even though they had the mandate after chapter 7 to enforce peace, and still they decided Dutch lives are worth more than any of the Bosnian lives, which resulted in the massacres of 8,000 boys and men. Do you think that there is a scenario in today's world where lives are all equal and worth protecting and saving? And I was wondering as well, you talk about the fragmented global order and how we see now new players on the horizon, such as Saudi Arabia, for example, whether that will perhaps change, or do you think that this is such a legacy that will always be the case?
Well, we are living in a paradigm shift. The West is no more hegemonic, and that changes everything. I don't know if it's for better or worse. That's another question. But that's a different situation. Obviously, life are not equal. We all know that. So it's not. It's not a scoop. The question is, there are no more rules of the game, and that's why everyone is arming and preparing the next war, and that's really frightening. Among the 10 countries which spend the most in defense, you have a lot of European countries as well. We all know what's happening between China and Taiwan, between the two Koreas. So the situation, I think, is extremely dangerous. And if I want to put a positive note, we can see that new mediators and the old one are Switzerland and Norway are very being marginalized. It's amazing the role of Qatar, the role of China in Myanmar, or trying to resume the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And so there is a new map which is emerging. But the dangers are just enormous. And we'll see what's happening on November 5th, and with the result of the American elections.
Okay, thank you.
I think I'm conscious of the time, and I want to make sure we have enough time for questions from the audience. So I'll just ask one more question, if that's okay, and then I'll hand to stop. One of the things I was thinking, listening to you, Pierre, and reading the book, is being a mediator must be extraordinarily hard. And I don't mean just in terms of the intellectual and political challenges that you grapple with, but I think the emotional costs of trying to deal with the really profound ethical dilemmas that mediators have to grapple with, and also the very real physical threats that you've mentioned. You talked about 2 of your colleagues who were killed in Mali, and so I wondered, to what extent do mediation organisations provide adequate support to mediators to help them anticipate physical and psychological risks that they may face, or to support them when they come back from deployment after those settings? And I'm wondering if more could be done within mediation frameworks to provide support for mediators. I know there's been a few peace agreements at one of the early stages was kind of writing in protections for those involved in that process, but that's hit and miss about how often that happens. So I'm wondering if there's more that could be done to formalise it.
Well, I think we need to be very modest. I think it's not so dangerous. I mean, people who are working in humanitarian organizations are much more exposed, or journalists like I used to be are much more exposed than people doing mediation. So, and I think especially, for instance, the International Committee of the Red Cross, they do provide some psychological support for their employees. So I think now there is some understanding that a number of our own people, and I'm thinking about other organizations, have been somehow traumatized, and it's important that they get some support, yes.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any last questions, Julia?
No, let's open up, I think, for the audience to engage. Do we use the microphones?
I think there are 2 microphones in the room. So if anybody has any questions, you want to raise your hand, and my colleague Louise or Declan will come to you with the microphone. So perhaps the gentleman here first.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So I just want to go back to, sorry, excuse me, a bit of a sore throat. So I just want to go back to your point earlier. You were talking about, the increase in defence spending. But I was just wondering, would you accept, or would you accept, I think, that appeasement is more of a line of thinking? And I'm thinking particularly here of Ukraine, because if you look back to 2014 in Crimea, right, Germany continues to build Nord Stream 2. Europe just kind of goes along with it, and I think there was arguably too much mediation and too much peace, and therefore all the deaths that we're seeing now around Kiev, around Lviv and so on could have been avoided. Similarly with Obama saying it was a red line for Assad to use chemical weapons and so on. So I'd say, do you think there's a failure of deterrence and that actually the increase in military spending could be towards a more peaceful world?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to take several questions at once? Maybe we start one by one.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And we can have different layers of replies. I think one of them is to go back to Iraq, because I think Iraq was a watershed moment. Because basically the big guy in town decided that he doesn't need to obey according to international law. And if you read the 2007 speech by Putin in Munich conference, which it's please Google it, you will see what Putin is saying is really impressive. Basically, he's saying, well, you don't care, I don't care. And then 2014, you're right, Crimea and the Eastern Donbass. And the Germans and the trade unions and the companies and everyone and the politicians said, yes, it's good for us to... The Russians are having such a great deal, getting so much money, that they wouldn't, for their own sake, jeopardize all that. It was the wrong calculation, totally wrong calculation. And now we realize that basically we might have an American president who wants to pivot regarding China and forget about Ukraine. And the West, even the Europe, is not in the position to replace the Americans. So the situation is extremely serious, yes.
Okay, I think there were two questions in the back earlier. No.
Thank you so much. I guess my question is, looking at, I'm studying the peace agreement in Colombia and looking at what happened there, like in 2016, the peace agreement was signed, and then there was a popular vote about the peace agreement, which didn't pass, surprisingly, for many reasons. But like, my first question would be like, how do you get throughout mediation that has done a certain level, then the popular support for it? And the second question is, what do you think in this regard is the role of the media? Because like, even now that there is this discussion about the total peace in Colombia, and I was in a very interesting event that was exchanging lesson learned from Northern Ireland to Colombia for the actual negotiation a week ago. And one of the things that they were saying is that the role that media can play and the lies that have been spread by media. And we see this with the conflict in Palestine right now, like the reporting is biased in many ways. So this can change and switch the public opinion. So what do you think about it?
Yeah, when it's true, when you want to discuss with someone, it's better to agree on basic facts. And if there is a disagreement is also concerning basic facts, you do have a problem, and we do have a big one. And it's true that social networks and platforms and media are creating some kind of fog, and it's very difficult and everyone is basically living more and more in or her own bubble. A cognitive bubble, which makes things much more difficult. But I will mention one or two things which are interesting, at least to me and hopefully to you. In my organization, they decided to create a digital team because cyber war is a real concern. So they started by. So there are different problems. Obviously, one of the obvious problem is what does look like an electronic ceasefire. It's difficult to define concretely. But nevertheless, there have been codes of conduct which have been established within the civil society in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in central Nigeria. There have been also in the Gulf some attempts to better coordinate the information has been achieved. There have been some discussions about artificial intelligence also, including artificial intelligence which could be installed in missiles. I don't know. I mean, I don't understand this military technology, but there have been some number of discussions between Chinese and American experts on that. So we are at the very beginning, of some thinking about how to address the question of artificial intelligence and fake news. And a lot of work will be done and has to be done.
Thank you for that. Yeah, can you hear me okay? Yeah. I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. I've got a question about the sort of pragmatics of the mediation team. Partly I've got an interest in this because I'm involved in some mediation with a UK political party. And although it's not armed conflict, it sort of can feel like it. But anyway, the question is really about how you form the team of mediators, how you would recruit people, get them on side, get them to understand what's needed without it becoming too much of a sort of groupthink. And so how you sort of embrace the diversity of what's needed whilst keeping everybody on track and not getting too disrupted by what's going on around them. So it's just really how you lead that and how you manage that process that I'm interested in. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it comes back, first of all, to have a team which reflects the diversity of opinion and needs to be credible. Very often you will try to get a former chief of a guerrilla and a former minister in your team in order to have the right access. So that's very important. And then to be very clear about your objective could be limited. I'm thinking about, in Central African Republic at one point, the question of COVID and vaccinations was important for distant populations and which were under the control of different armed groups. So you had very limited objectives, and that makes it so much easier. If you are trying to change the atmosphere among British political parties, the goal is much more ambitious, but also much more vague, and then your difficulty will be to identify what steps or what concrete limited objective you can go on your road, and who else can help you on this journey, which are fascinating but difficult, I guess.
So I think there was one question here in that row, yeah? Here in the third row. And then, yeah.
Thank you. So many questions, but I'll confine myself to one. I think sometimes people view the peace agreement as like the end goal, but arguably the peace agreement is just the first step. It's just the first part of it. So in terms of maintaining peace and mediating whenever there's people who think the law doesn't apply to them, how do you think people can move forward after the peace agreement has been signed?
Yeah, you're just so right. First of all, 50% of peace agreements are failing within 5 or 10 years' time. That's the first fact, which is frightening. And it's true that there is some kind of the fact that a piece of paper has been signed has some kind of almost sacred value, and it's true that very often there is some type of disengagement happening, which is very unfortunate. And I was struck. I was listening to 1 o'clock news today, and there are so many references about the troubles. And I was even shocked myself that it's so much present here. And if you go to other places, situation would be different. So it means that a lot of work needs to be done. And I guess there are different avenues. And I know that there are a lot of excellent experts in Northern Ireland, so I won't say anything about that. But I think the question of investment in how you change and long-term views and identity and education and future, sense of future, is all so important. So the question is to find, I guess, the right tools in order to address your specific society.
Okay, yes, there is a question here on this. Yes, exactly.
So I would like to ask about, since this is about armed conflict, right? That's sort of about like guns, that's about swords, that's about like bombs and so on. Let's escalate slightly and talk about nuclear bombs. How would the presence or the involvement of, say, nuclear weapons, how would that change the potential dialogue for an armed conflict? Would that increase the stakes? Would that be a different approach or so on?
Well, it's that's the situation between, and it makes me think about international law. When Putin was indicted, the former Russian president Medvedev threatened to send a nuclear bomb on the International Criminal Court. So, and it's true that Ukraine decided to give up Soviet nukes at the time of its independence. And maybe if it would have kept them, maybe the situation today would be very different. And it seems that Israel has 200 nuclear bombs. So we can imagine what fireworks it could look like. So it's just a parameter we need to live with, the process of dissemination of nuclear weapons. It's happening, and I think more and more countries want to have it. And I think at one point deterrence has worked, but will it always work? That's the question.
That was question way back, and then.
Thank you. I'll move over where I can be seen. This may build on one or two of the previous questions. There was a word you used earlier on in your comments. I think the word was connectors, people who were able to reach key people, perhaps on each side of a conflict. And I want to ask about that with a particular example in mind. Back in the 1980s, the University of Edinburgh hosted conversations between Soviet, American and British diplomats, military officials and academics, which were called the Edinburgh Conversations. And it is said that the Edinburgh Conversations had a significant impact on the Cold War, and indeed in bringing about an end to the Cold War. The key figure was one Professor John Erickson, who was Professor of Defence Studies at the University of Edinburgh, the leading Western expert on Soviet military affairs and Soviet strategy. He was as highly respected in the Kremlin as he was in the Pentagon. And it seemed to me that he, and I'm interested in your comments on this, exemplified the idea of a connector. He was able to connect both with the Russians and with the Americans equally and completely impartially. So my question is, how do you find and identify people like that in the present day? And if you can't find people like that, what do you do?
think you spend some time to find the right people. It takes time. But there are people who are... I think you'd find these people. They do exist. What you refer is a specific case with someone who has this extraordinary quality to be a credible person for both sides. But that's almost unique, I would say. Most of the time, you will have different people. Then you are entering in possibly some problems, I would say. Because every person who has been close to a government still has an agenda or a political view or a way to apprehend and comprehend and understand the conflict. And the one who used to be in the jungle for 20 years still also has his own views. So you need to be sure that they are still with you and not going somewhere else. And that needs to be extremely careful that coherence is still happening. And then sometimes you have an additional problems if we speak about challenges. I mean, private organizations, they need donors. But donors, they have their own political agenda. And if you have many donors, maybe the political agendas don't exactly coincide. So there are all these different parameters you need to be totally aware of in order to mitigate the risks.
Yes.
Thanks very much, very interesting. Can I ask about confidentiality? We accept that mediation is usually done behind closed doors and very confidentially, and yet the relationship which a couple of people asked about public opinion is a paradox. So in '98, when we had the Belfast Agreement, everyone knew what was going on. It was still an elite accommodation. There was no public participation, but let's leave that aside. I ran the Yes campaign, and everyone knew it was a clear decision, yes or no. But in 2004, I helped on the Cyprus referendum, the Annan Plan, which was lost because the Greek side voted against. In 2016, I advised President Santos in the Colombia referendum, and it was lost by 50,000 votes, but 50,000 votes, it was lost. In 2018, I advised on the Macedonia referendum to change the name to North Macedonia. It was lost because of the turnout. So either I'm a very bad campaigner, or we have a problem with that balance between rigid confidentiality, and that's what I have to do when I'm in those negotiations, and keeping people on board and letting them know what you're doing so that they can understand, support, and participate in it. And that's why 26 years after Good Friday, we still have 4 or 5 armed groups, and we are not making that sort of progress.
Yeah, I think you are touching a very important point. And it's some kind of contradiction or rather tension. On the one hand, you need a degree of confidentiality because otherwise you are going nowhere. But in the same time, you need to have the society behind you. And so sometimes you need to find ways to involve, to create some kind of alliance while the process is still confidential, but you are building your own movement in order that when the day will happen, then you will have some support. Very often, if we think about, I'm thinking about different situations, Mali, population was not aware of anything when the peace treaty was signed. It was a shock and we didn't want to, and it failed. So in the Basque country, it was interesting because there was the international contact group, which was doing mostly, I mean, it was sometimes public, which was important in the sense that it helped the society to get prepared to the next step. And then you had also a confidential part by this group or by another group. And this combination worked pretty well. So I think it's more trying to address, to prepare the society. And I think there are different ways to do that. So I think it's not insurmountable, but it needs to be, and very often mediators tend to just to concentrate and to be focused on the specifics and don't think in terms of society and changes which need to happen within the society. You're right.
Thank you. You still? Yeah? Yeah, here at the very front, please. Yeah, I think it's coming.
Thank you. I want to come back to mediation as a process, I suppose, and research is showing that the number of conflict resolved through mediation is declining or has declined already. And researchers like Svensson advanced that it has to do with the fact that an increasing numbers of conflict have to do with Islam or relate to Islam, are jihadi conflicts. So I wonder what the state of your reflection and your organizations, what it's thinking about it and what it's doing about this.
There have been a number of organizations which were never interested in mediation. One is Shining Path, for instance. It's a classical example. With ISIS, there have been limited conversations and still happening with the ICRC for humanitarian reasons, basically. But the map, the geopolitical map is changing fast. And it's not only jihadism, is the geopolitical tensions. I mean, it's extraordinary that Ukrainian soldiers ambushed Russian or Wagner soldiers in northern Mali. I think it's something new. I mean, local conflicts are becoming global conflict as well. And that's creating a lot of zero-sum game process. And that makes things much more difficult. So if you think about Sudan, you can say it's two generals fighting each other. But you can say, well, there are the Emirates, you have Iran, you have Egypt, you have Saudi Arabia, and so many others who are players as well. And each one has its own agenda. So that's, and everyone now expects some kind of major war. And that's why people are investing so much in defense. And so exactly the mood and the expectations are changing, and everyone is basically getting afraid. And that's the worst situation. Sorry about that.
When sort of mediating with armed groups that aren't national governments, are there certain concessions that you can't really make because they could be seen as like granting these groups a form of legitimacy, for instance? Or is there any issues around being seen to give these sorts of non-national armed groups legitimacy?
Yeah, it's a very good point, and I guess there are different degrees of legitimacy. To engage confidentiality with a mediation organization is a limited, very limited legitimacy being given. But then you can offer more as the process goes on. You can introduce them to diplomats, and then you can continue on and on and on. So you can make something like a stick or a carrot to play with the question of legitimacy. and say more you are inclined to discuss and to move ahead in the peace process, well, you get more support, you get possibly more humanitarian aid, you get more, I don't know what, but so there is some give and take in the process, yes. And legitimacy has a value. And it's important that this value should be used only at a specific time, not too early, not too late. I mean, it has its own temporality.
Are there any more questions? Yes, here in the middle.
Hi, my question is related to the previous question regarding connectors and specifically universities. From your experience, are they a legitimate mediation partner on the ground, also of this sort of middle ground between elite or top governance and more grassroots communities? Thank you.
Sorry, I'm not sure to have understood. I mean, the role
of universities as a legitimate partner in mediation work, as this institution that stands sort of in the middle of more top-level governance and grassroots communities.
Well, I guess regarding civil society, yes, you can engage in with different sides in a conflict. Yes, I think universities can play a role, and they do play a role. So I think one example was given earlier. So yes, definitely.
I think we have time for one more question here in the first row.
I'm finding it difficult to frame this question. Given the impact of colonialism and the borders drawn after the First World War, is there a case to be made for redrawing borders within conflict zones? I'm thinking particularly of Africa. For example, the nation states as defined by the colonial powers, which have then been given legitimacy through the United Nations, but yet and withal they are not defined by the peoples therein. And how would the ideas from the breakup of the former Yugoslav Republic, how could they be applied in conflict resolution that involved perhaps redrawing borders?
Well, I mean...
That is tough.
Well, the easy answer is to say that the African Union is opposed to that idea. So then it's mostly situation which can create that case, and we can think about South Sudan. And Sudan, if the war goes on for a very long time, we don't know, might split again. Is a peace process conceivable in order or conference or an international conference to debate about borders and to redraw them? It's wow! It's a huge thing to do in a society. Don't forget that most of the society in Africa are very young also, and they are urban also. They are living in cities. Most of the African population are living in cities. In Niger, the average age is 15 years old. So I don't know to which extent the question of nation-state is talking to them. That's an interesting point. I never thought about it, but I don't know. It's something to explore, but that will be a huge endeavor. I wish you good luck.
Thank you.
Well, on that note, I think it's probably time for us to close the Q&A at this point. I think we all go away today with a lot of food for thought. Pierre really has taken us to an exploration of global conflict all over the world, and at the same time has given us an insight into really the world of conflict mediation and given us a picture of the many difficult choices you have to make in the process of reaching eventually peace. I have to thank a couple of individuals and institutions before we all go home. First of all, Declan Coyle over there for the help in this event tonight, but also Cheryl Lothar in this School of Law in the run-up to the event. Of course, Professor Dr. Richard English, Director of the Senator George Mitchell Institute for Global Peace and Security and Justice, who have provided some financial support. Also, Wendy Louise Smith and Louise Milligan, also at the very back here, for support on the day and the run-up to the event. The School of Social Science, Education and Social Work, who has funded this event. And of course, last but not least, you as a very engaged and very quizzing audience. And please do join me all in thanking Pierre.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. What?
So many aspects to your work I didn't know before.
Really?